There is a tale told in the quiet corners of the county, a story so stained with sorrow and shame that it is seldom spoken above a whisper. It concerns the fate of the Blackwood family, whose name was once synonymous with the wealth of Ironwood Manor, and whose end was as sudden and brutal as a winter storm. The particulars were recorded by the local parson, a man named Albright, who believed that some horrors must be set down in ink, if only as a warning to future generations who might tread too close to the fire of forbidden passions. This is his account, as I have heard it told by my own grandfather, who knew the man. I shall endeavor to tell it plainly, as one recounts a piece of local history, for that, in truth, is what it is. In the year of our Lord 1822, the Blackwood family stood as the undisputed masters of a vast estate nestled in a damp and lonely valley in the north of England. The head of this house was Sir Alistair Blackwood, a man whose character had been forged in the cold fires of commerce and colonial ambition. He was a widower, his wife, Lady Beatrice, having succumbed to a lingering consumption some years prior, leaving him with a single child, a daughter named Elara. She was 17 years of age when our story properly begins, a creature of such delicate beauty and sheltered innocence that she seemed a thing of moonlight, ill-suited for the grim, stone-built world of Ironwood. The manor itself was a gaunt, grey edifice, perpetually draped in ivy and a fine mist that rose from the surrounding fens. Its windows stared out over the bleak landscape like the sightless eyes of a skull, and the wind that moaned through its countless chimneys carried a perpetual chill, even in high summer. The primary source of the Blackwood fortune, and the source of the valley's pervasive gloom, was the Blackwood tin mine. It was a brutal, gaping wound upon the hillside, its dark mouth spewing forth not only but a perpetual shroud of grime and despair that settled over the land and its people. The workforce was comprised of wretches from the local poorhouse and, it was whispered, men brought in chains from distant, heathen shores, their passage paid for by Sir Alistair himself to ensure a pliant and disposable labor force. It was among this latter group that a young man labored, known to all only as Kael. He was a tall, powerfully built figure, his skin the color of rich mahogany, his eyes holding a silent, simmering intelligence that marked him apart from the other broken souls. He never spoke, and it was assumed by the overseers and even the gentry that he understood little of our tongue, but his strength and endurance were legendary. It was said he could lift a cart from a ditch alone and work a 12-hour shift in the deepest, most airless part of the mine without faltering. It was this very singularity, this aura of contained power amidst utter subjugation, that first drew the eye of Elara Blackwood. From the high, leaded window of her solar, a room that felt more like a beautifully appointed prison, Elara would often watch the line of miners trudge to and from the pit. Her life was one of profound isolation, bounded by embroidery, devotional readings, and the stern, infrequent attentions of her father, who saw her less as a daughter and more as an asset to be managed until a profitable marriage could be arranged. She was a bird in a gilded cage, and her gaze, starved for any sight that was not a tapestry or a prayer book, began to linger on the silent, stoic form of Kael. There was a nobility in his suffering, she fancied, a grace in his powerful movements that stood in stark contrast to the coarse brutality of the overseers. She began to invent stories for him in her mind, that he was a prince stolen from his kingdom, a warrior of great renown, a spirit of the earth condemned to toil within it. It was a young girl's fancy, born of novels and loneliness, but it took root in her heart with the tenacity of a weed. She started taking walks along the muddy path where the workers would pass at dawn and dusk, her maid, a nervous girl named Mary, trailing behind, casting fretful glances towards the grim procession. Elara would sometimes deliberately drop a handkerchief or a spool of silk, hoping for a glance, a gesture, some small sign of acknowledgement from the one they called Kael. For weeks, there was none. His eyes, when they were visible beneath the grime, remained fixed on the ground a few feet ahead, his thoughts his own, a fortress against the world that had enslaved him. But obsession, as I have said, is a patient hunter, and Elara Blackwood had little else to occupy her days but to wait. The turning point, the moment the spark of Elara's distant fascination was fanned into the first dangerous flames of direct action, came not in a grand event, but in a burst of savage, commonplace brutality. It was an unseasonably cold afternoon in early autumn, the sky the color of lead, promising a bitter winter. A fight had broken out near the mine head, a squalid and frequent occurrence born of desperation, cramped quarters, and the cheap, fiery gin that was the workers' only solace. An overseer, a vicious, red-faced man named Higgs with a body like a barrel and a soul to match, had laid into two brawling workers with his leather whip, the crack of it echoing against the stone buildings like gunshots. One of the men, a hulking Cornishman named Tregear, driven beyond endurance by pain and rage, turned on Higgs with a rock clutched in his fist. In an instant, the scene descended from punishment into a potential lynching. A murmur, low and dangerous, rippled through the crowd of weary men. The other overseers, sensing the shift, hesitated, their hands going to their own whips and cudgels. It was then that Kael moved. He did not shout or roar. He did not join the mob. He simply stepped between the advancing Tregear and the cornered, panting Higgs. He moved with an unnerving, fluid grace, his silence more commanding than any battle cry. He stood, a wall of muscle and resolve, his dark eyes fixed not on Tregear, but on the men behind him. He said nothing. He merely raised a hand, palm out, a gesture of stillness, of cessation. The rock, poised to strike, faltered in Tregear's grip. The murmur died. Kael's presence alone, his unspoken authority, quelled the riot before it could truly begin. He then turned, took the whip from Higgs's slackened hand, and offered it back to him, his expression unreadable. The moment was over. Order, of a sort, was restored. But Elara, watching from the cover of a stand of skeletal birch trees, her heart hammering against her ribs, had seen it all. She had witnessed not a slave's obedience, but a king's command. Her romantic fantasy was, in that moment, confirmed as irrefutable truth in her mind. He was a prince, a leader, a man of innate power, cruelly imprisoned. This incident, small in the grand ledger of the mine's miseries, altered Kael's position in a subtle but profound way. Higgs, a coward at his core, now viewed Kael with a mixture of fear and a grudging utilitarian respect. He was given slightly less back-breaking work, tasked occasionally with managing the other workers, a silent foreman of the damned. This slight elevation brought him marginally closer to the world of the main house, and crucially, it fixed him more firmly in Elara's view. Her walks became more deliberate, her dropped items more valuable. A single, perfect red rose from the hothouse, a small, leather-bound book of poetry. She was laying a trail of breadcrumbs, not to find her way home, but to lose herself completely. One evening, as a thick fog began to coil up from the marshes, swallowing the sound of the men's trudging feet, she managed to drop her lace shawl directly in his path. He stopped. The other workers shuffled past him, heads down, too tired to notice. He looked down at the delicate white fabric, a stark, almost blasphemous purity against the churned, black mud. Then, slowly he bent and picked it up. He did not immediately hand it back. He stood, holding it, his large, calloused fingers tracing the intricate pattern. Elara, her breath caught in her throat, stepped from the shadows of the trees. Mary, her maid, gasped softly and tried to pull her back, but Elara shook her off. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to scream in the damp silence. Kael's eyes lifted from the shawl to her face. It was the first time he had truly looked at her. His gaze was not that of a slave to his master's daughter. It was deep, ancient, and held a sorrow so vast it felt like a physical weight. He saw not a savior, nor a foolish girl, but simply a woman. He held out the shawl. As she took it, her fingers, pale and soft, brushed against his, which were rough and scarred, the skin cracked and permanently stained with the earth's dark minerals. It was a contact that lasted less than a second, but it sent a jolt through her, a current of something terrifying and exhilarating. It was the touch of the real world, a world of hardship and strength she had only ever read about. "I am Elara," she whispered, as if her name were a secret she was entrusting to him. He said nothing. His eyes held hers for a moment longer, and in their dark depths, she fancied she saw a flicker of something, not recognition of her name, but recognition of her, of the strange, reckless act she was committing. Then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and was swallowed by the fog, leaving her standing alone on the path, the mud staining the hem of her expensive gown, her hands still tingling from the touch, her fate now irrevocably tied to the silent, enslaved man walking into the gloom. The first thread of the tapestry of their ruin had been pulled. The memory of that fleeting touch became a holy relic to Elara, a secret she polished and examined in the lonely quiet of her chamber. The rough texture of his skin against her softness was a sensation she could summon at will, a brand upon her consciousness. Her world, once defined by the stifling geometry of the manor's corridors and the predictable rhythm of social calls and needlework, now possessed a secret, thrilling axis around which everything else spun. Kael was no longer a distant figure of pity and fantasy. He was a real, physical presence whose silence spoke to her more eloquently than any of the vapid compliments paid by the sons of local gentry during their tedious, chaperoned visits. Her walks became a daily pilgrimage, no longer a mere diversion but the central purpose of her existence. Mary, the maid, grew increasingly anxious, her plain face etched with a worry she dared not fully voice. "Miss Elara," she would plead in a hushed tone, "your father, if he were to hear of this, and the fog, it's so thick today, it isn't proper for a lady." But Elara, possessed by a fervor that bordered on the religious, would dismiss her concerns with an uncharacteristic sharpness. Propriety, that rigid cage she had been born into, now seemed a flimsy and foolish construct. What were its rules compared to the profound, wordless connection she felt with Kael? She began to engineer their encounters with greater audacity. She discovered a disused potting shed on the edge of the formal gardens, a place forgotten by the groundskeepers, its windows grimy, its interior smelling of damp earth and decay. It stood perilously close to the path the workers took to a remote section of the estate's timber yard. Here, she began to leave things for him. It started with practical items, a silent apology for the world's cruelty, a loaf of fresh bread, wrapped in a clean cloth, a wedge of hard cheese, a small pot of salve for chapped hands, stolen from the housekeeper's stores. She would leave them on a broken bench inside the shed, and by the next day, they would be gone. He never acknowledged these gifts, but their disappearance was a form of communication more intimate to her than any letter. Emboldened, she began leaving other tokens. A single, stark white feather she had found. A smooth, gray river stone. And then one day a book. It was a small volume of John Donne's poetry, its leather cover worn soft with use. She chose it for the lines she had secretly underlined: "Love, all alike, no season knows, nor clime, nor hours, days, months, which are the rags of time." She left it in the shed and waited, her stomach a tight knot of anticipation. The following evening, as a cold drizzle fell, she slipped away from the manor and went to the shed. The book was gone. In its place, on the same bench, lay a small, clumsily carved figure. It was a bird, its form abstract but unmistakable, fashioned from a piece of dark, polished wood that felt warm to the touch. It was a response, a gift, a testament that he understood not just her acts of charity, but the language of her heart. She clutched the wooden bird to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The need for speech, for direct communion, became an unbearable pressure within her. One afternoon, seeing him lag behind the others, his task of hauling a heavy timber completed, she gathered every ounce of her courage and stepped directly into his path. The drizzle had matted his hair to his brow and plastered his rough shirt to his powerful frame. He stopped, his expression unreadable, but he did not look away. I received your gift," she said, her voice trembling. "The bird. It is exquisite." He was silent, his dark eyes watching her, assessing her. Do you understand me?" she asked, the question sounding foolish and desperate even to her own ears. A long moment passed. The only sound was the drip of water from the trees and the distant caw of a rook. Then he nodded. A single, slow, deliberate nod. The confirmation was like a key turning in a lock deep inside her. "My name is Elara," she said again, as if formally introducing herself for the first time. He watched her, his chest rising and falling with his steady breath. Then he raised a hand and touched his own chest. "Kael," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble, like stones grinding deep underground. It was the first word she had ever heard him speak, and it was his name. His true name. Not the label Kael, imposed by his captors, but the name given to him by his mother, in a land she could only imagine. The sound of it was foreign, beautiful, and powerful. It was a secret more precious than any jewel. From that day, their meetings in the potting shed, always brief and fraught with danger, became their secret world. She learned that he understood far more English than he let on. His silence was a shield, a strategic retreat into himself for survival. In halting phrases, mixed with gestures, he told her fragments of his story. A village on a coast where the water was warm and the color of turquoise. A people who were farmers and fishermen, not slaves. A raid in the night, the screams, the fire, the long, hellish voyage across the ocean in chains. He did not speak of it with self-pity, but with a grim, resigned pain that broke her heart and solidified her resolve. She saw in him a nobility that her father's world, with its greed and its cruel hierarchies, could never comprehend. She, in turn, spoke to him of her own prison. Of her mother's death, of her father's cold, transactional view of human relationships, of the suffocating emptiness of her life. She spoke of her dreams, of a cottage by the sea, of a life built on something other than ownership and subjugation. He listened, truly listened, in a way no one ever had. In the damp, shadowy confines of the shed, surrounded by the tools of a forgotten gardener, they built a fragile universe for two, a universe constructed on stolen moments, whispered confidences, and a love that grew as wildly and uncontrollably as poison ivy, beautiful to the one who craves it, deadly to the one who embraces it. They were no longer master's daughter and enslaved man. They were Elara and Kael, two souls adrift, who had found in each other a dangerous and impossible harbor. The heady intoxication of their secret world, a fragile bubble of whispered confidences and stolen glances, could not exist forever in the grim reality of Ironwood. Its pop was not a gentle sigh, but a cataclysm born of carelessness and the ever-present, watchful eyes of the estate. For Elara, the potting shed became the true heart of the manor, its damp earth scent more fragrant than any perfume, its silence more sacred than any church. She lived from one clandestine meeting to the next, her mind a whirlwind of plans and fantasies. She began to pilfer more than just salve and food from the household stores. A woolen blanket, a tinderbox, a small knife, these she saw not as theft, but as investments in a future she was desperately constructing in her mind, a future where she and Kael would simply vanish into the mist one evening, never to be seen again. She became reckless. Her walks grew longer, her excuses to her father, headaches, a desire for solitude to read, the benefits of the fresh air for her constitution, more frequent and flimsy. Sir Alistair, though largely absent, either buried in his account books in London or riding the boundaries of his estate with a grim possessiveness, was not a fool. He noticed a change in his daughter. The listless, compliant girl was gone, replaced by a creature with a feverish brightness in her eyes, a new sharpness to her tone when questioned, and a distracted air that was wholly unfamiliar. He initially attributed it to the fanciful whims of a girl on the cusp of womanhood, perhaps even to the prospect of a suitable match he had recently begun to consider with the eldest son of a neighboring baronet. But a deep-seated paternal instinct, one that was less about love and more about ownership, began to prickle with unease. The instrument of their discovery was not Sir Alistair himself, but his most trusted and vicious overseer, the same Higgs whose life Kael had indirectly saved. Higgs, a man whose soul was as coarse as his manners, had long nursed a bitter resentment towards the silent slave who commanded a respect Higgs had to beat into others. He also possessed the low cunning of a predator. He noticed things. He noticed the way the master's fine daughter seemed to be everywhere the work gangs were, a pale, spectral figure on the periphery. He noticed the particular, lingering look she cast towards the one called Kael. And he noticed, with a slow dawning and malicious understanding, that Kael was no longer quite as broken, his silence now seeming contemplative rather than defeated. Driven by a mix of suspicion and a desire to uncover a transgression that would allow him to crush the man who shamed him, Higgs began his own surveillance. He did not follow Elara, that was too dangerous. Instead, he watched Kael. He observed the slight detours the man would take, the way his eyes would scan the tree line not with the blank stare of exhaustion, but with the focused attention of someone expecting a signal. It took him a week to identify the disused potting shed as the locus of this mystery. On a day when a cold, relentless rain fell, turning the paths to streams of mud, Higgs saw his chance. The weather would keep prying eyes indoors. He watched as Elara, a dark cloak pulled over her fine dress, darted from the garden gate towards the shed. Moments later, he saw Kael, having finished his task early, slip away from the timber yard and move in the same direction. A cruel, triumphant smile split Higgs's coarse features. This was more than he had dared hope for. This was not just an infraction of rules. This was a sin that shook the very foundations of the world he and Sir Alistair ruled. This was treasure. He did not confront them. Instead, he positioned himself where he could hear the low murmur of voices from within the shed, though the drumming rain made the words indistinct. He waited, a patient spider, until Elara emerged, her face flushed with an emotion that was unmistakably a mixture of anguish and passion. He waited until Kael had returned to the barracks. Then, with the news burning a hole in his mind, he went straight to the main house, demanding an immediate audience with Sir Alistair. He found the master in his library, a room paneled in dark oak and lined with leather-bound books that were bought by the yard for show, not for reading. Sir Alistair was reviewing a ledger, his face a mask of concentration. He looked up, his impatience clear. "What is it, Higgs? This had better be important." "Oh, it's important, Sir Alistair," Higgs said, his voice a low, greasy whisper. "It's about your daughter." He paused, savoring the moment. "And the slave Kael." Sir Alistair's pen stilled. He did not move, but the air in the room grew cold and heavy. "Explain yourself," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Higgs spilled his story, embellishing where he could, painting a picture of a long-standing, sordid affair conducted under the very nose of the master. He spoke of secret meetings, of stolen gifts, of the look on Miss Elara's face. "I heard them talking, sir," he lied, leaning forward. "Plain as day. In that old potting shed by the timber yard. She was weeping for him, sir. Calling him by some heathen name." Sir Alistair Blackwood listened, his face gradually hardening into a mask of such pure, unadulterated fury that even Higgs, a man familiar with violence, felt a chill of fear. It was not the anger of a betrayed father, but the cold, incandescent rage of a man whose property has been defiled, whose absolute authority has been mocked. His daughter, his blood, his key to a strategic alliance, had not just disobeyed him, she had dragged his name, his legacy, through the filth of the slave quarters. She had chosen a piece of property over her own birthright. The insult was so profound it was beyond shouting. It demanded a punishment of biblical proportions. He dismissed Higgs with a curt nod and a silent promise of a substantial reward. Then he sat, alone in the gloom of the library, as the rain beat against the windows. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest raging within him. Plans for her future, for his dynasty, lay in ashes. But from those ashes, a new, terrible design began to form. He would not merely forbid it. He would not simply punish the slave. He would break them both. He would make his daughter understand the full, horrific cost of her betrayal. He would force her to gaze into the abyss she so recklessly admired, and then he would push her in. The summons came not from a servant, but from her father himself. His voice, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, echoed up the grand staircase, calling her name just as she was returning to her chamber, her cloak still damp from the rain, the memory of Kael's hands on hers still a warm, thrilling secret against her skin. "Elara! To the library! Now!" The tone brooked no delay, no question. It was the voice he used with stewards who had failed him and merchants who had cheated him. A fist of cold dread clenched in Elara's stomach, so violently she felt her breath catch. Had Mary spoken? Had someone seen her? She smoothed her dress with trembling hands, the coarse, damp wool of her cloak suddenly feeling like a shroud. She entered the library. The room was lit only by the fire blazing in the great hearth and a single candelabra on her father's desk. It threw long, dancing shadows that seemed to cling to the corners like malevolent spirits. Sir Alistair stood before the fire, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. He did not turn as she entered. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the logs and the frantic hammering of her own heart. "Close the door," he said, his voice still deceptively calm. She did, the heavy oak clicking shut with a finality that sounded like a tomb ceiling. "I have received a most extraordinary report," he began, still addressing the flames. "A tale so fantastical, so grotesque, that I would have dismissed its teller as a drunkard or a madman, were it not for the corroborating evidence of your own recent behavior." He finally turned. His face was not flushed with anger as she had expected. It was pale, his features carved from marble, but his eyes were two chips of black flint, burning with a cold, inner fire. "You have been seen consorting with the slave called Kael." Elara's blood ran cold. She opened her mouth to deny it, to lie, but the words died in her throat under his piercing gaze. He knew. "Speak." The word cracked through the room like a whip. "Is it true?" She drew herself up, a desperate, foolish courage born of her love rising within her. "We have spoken, father. That is all. He is not what you think. He has a name. It is Kael. He was a prince in his own land." "A prince?" Sir Alistair's laugh was a short, ugly sound, devoid of any humor. "By God, the girl is even more a fool than I feared. He is a savage, Elara. A piece of property, bought and paid for, with less wit and worth than the horse I ride. And you would debase yourself, debase my name, by trailing after him in the mud like a common strumpet? Do not speak of him that way," she cried, her voice shaking with a mixture of terror and defiance. "You know nothing of him. He is more of a man than any of the simpering boys you would have me marry. He is noble and kind, and he has suffered." "Suffered?" Her father roared, finally unleashing the tempest. He took a step towards her, and she flinched back. "You speak to me of suffering? You, who have known nothing but silk and silver? You dare to pity that animal? Your sentimentality is a sickness, girl, and tonight, I will cure you of it." He leaned forward, his face inches from hers, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think this is a romance from one of your novels? You think this ends with you running away to some blissful cottage? This ends now. You will never look upon him again. You will never speak his name. You will forget he exists. Do you understand me?" The finality in his voice was terrifying. This was the end of her world. The thought of never seeing Kael again, of never hearing his voice, was a pain more acute than any physical blow. The future without him was not a future at all. It was a return to the gilded cage, but now with the door welded shut. A desperate, reckless clarity descended upon her. "No," she whispered. His eyes widened in disbelief. "What did you say?" "I said no," she repeated, her voice gaining a shred of strength. "I will not. I love him." For a long moment, Sir Alistair simply stared at her, as if she had grown a second head. Then a strange, terrifying calm settled over him. The rage did not disappear, but it condensed, hardened into something infinitely more cruel and calculating. He walked slowly back to his desk and sat down, steepling his fingers. He looked at her not as a furious father, but as a merchant considering a bankrupt business partner. "Love," he said, the word a sneer. "A pretty word for a destructive folly. Very well. You force my hand, Elara. You leave me no room for paternal gentleness." He paused, letting the silence weigh upon her. "I shall present you with a choice. A simple one. You will make it now, and you will live with the consequences for the rest of your days." Elara stood frozen, her heart a trapped bird beating against her ribs. "Option the first," he said, his voice flat and judicial. "You renounce this creature. You pledge to me, on your mother's memory, that you will never again seek him out, speak of him, or even think of him. You will resume your place as my daughter, the heiress of Ironwood. You will marry the man I choose for you, and you will be the lady you were born to be. This incident will be forgotten. This is the path of duty, of family, of your station. He leaned forward, his flint-like eyes pinning her to the spot. Option the second, he hissed. You persist in this madness. You choose him. And if you do, you shall have him. But you will have him on my terms. You will share his fate. You will forfeit your name, your title, your inheritance. You will no longer be Elara Blackwood. You will be nothing. You will live as he lives. You will work as he works. You will be property just as he is property. You will learn the true meaning of the words you so glibly throw about: suffering, hardship, nobility. He smiled then, a thin, cruel curve of the lips that did not reach his eyes. So choose, daughter. Will you be my child, or will you be a slave's whore? The room seemed to tilt. The air grew thin. The two futures he presented yawned before her like two different abysses. On one side, a life of comfortable, soul-crushing emptiness, a betrayal of everything she now felt was real and true. On the other, a life of certain hardship, misery, and social death, but a life with Kael. In her romantic, fevered mind, the choice was not between comfort and poverty, but between a living death and a life of authentic, if difficult, love. She saw his face, heard his voice saying his true name, Kael. She thought of the wooden bird, warm in her hand. She thought of the future they had dreamed of in the potting shed. It was no choice at all. She lifted her chin, meeting her father's pitiless gaze. Her voice, when it came, was clear and steady, ringing with a tragic finality in the silent room. I choose him. For a long, suspended moment, there was only silence. Sir Alistair did not rage. He did not shout. He simply stared at his daughter, and in the depths of his cold, flint-like eyes, Elara saw something die. It was not love, for she doubted it had ever truly resided there, but the last vestige of paternal recognition. She was no longer his daughter. She was a problem to be solved, a rebellious asset to be liquidated in the most punitive manner possible. A slow, grim smile, devoid of any warmth or triumph, stretched his thin lips. It was the smile of a man whose most terrible suspicion has been confirmed, freeing him from any last shred of mercy. So be it, he said, his voice a low, dry rasp, like stones grinding together in a deep well. He rose from his chair with a deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness. You have made your choice. Now you will learn its price. He walked to the fireplace and pulled the bell rope. The distant, muted chime echoed through the silent house like a death knell. Within moments, the library door opened and Mrs. Darrow, the stern-faced housekeeper, entered, her keys jangling at her waist. She glanced from Sir Alistair's stony countenance to Elara's pale, defiant one, and her expression tightened with foreboding. Mrs. Darrow, Sir Alistair began, his tone that of a man giving the most mundane of orders. My daughter has elected to embark on a path of profound humility. She has chosen to renounce her station. Effective immediately, she is no longer a member of this household. The housekeeper's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Sir? I don't understand. You do not need to understand, he replied coldly. You need only to obey. You will escort her to her chamber. She will remove the dress she is wearing, every stitch of clothing that belongs to this house, every ribbon, every jewel. She is to be given the roughest, plainest linsey-woolsey shift you can find in the servant stores. Nothing more. Then, you will bring her to the back courtyard. Elara stood frozen, the reality of his words beginning to seep through the adrenaline of her defiance. The dress she wore, a fine muslin day dress, suddenly felt like a foreign skin she was about to be flayed from. Father, she whispered, a first, faint tremor of fear in her voice. You forfeited the right to call me that, he interrupted, not even looking at her. To Mrs. Darrow now. Tears welled in Mrs. Darrow's eyes, but a lifetime of servitude and fear kept her silent. She curtsied, her body stiff with distress. Come, Miss Elara, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. The walk up the grand staircase was the longest of Elara's life. Each portrait of a stern Blackwood ancestor seemed to stare down at her with accusatory disdain. Her bedchamber, once her sanctuary, now felt like a stage from which she was about to be forcibly ejected. With trembling hands, assisted by the weeping Mrs. Darrow, she undid the buttons of her dress, let it pool at her feet. She removed her petticoats, her silk stockings, her delicate kid leather shoes. Finally, she unfastened the single strand of pearls at her throat, her mother's pearls, and laid them on the dressing table. They looked like a handful of frozen tears. Mrs. Darrow returned with a garment of coarse, gray, unbleached linsey-woolsey. It was scratchy and smelled of lye and dust. As Elara pulled it over her head, the rough fabric abraded her soft skin, a physical manifestation of her new existence. It hung on her, shapeless and sack-like, a brutal contrast to the tailored finery she had always known. She was given a pair of crude wooden clogs that were too large for her feet. "May the Lord have mercy on you, child," Mrs. Darrow whispered, wiping her eyes with her apron as she led the shivering, clattering figure back down the servants' staircase, a route Elara had never before taken. The back courtyard was a place of utility and grime, far from the manicured gardens at the front of the house. The cold cobblestones bit through the thin soles of the clogs. A fine, icy drizzle had begun to fall, plastering her hair to her scalp and causing the coarse shift to cling to her body, offering no warmth. Awaiting them were Sir Alistair and Higgs, who stood with a look of barely concealed, gloating satisfaction. Sir Alistair looked his daughter up and down, from her bare, muddy feet in the oversized clogs to her rain-soaked hair. A flicker of something, not regret, but perhaps a final, clinical assessment of the ruin he had wrought, crossed his face. "You see, Higgs," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the damp air. "This is what becomes of misplaced affection and rebellion. Remember it." He then turned his gaze fully to Elara. "You wish to be closer to your beloved. Your wish is granted. Higgs will take you to the slave quarters. You will be assigned a pallet there. Your labor begins at first light. You will learn what it truly means to have nothing." He gave a curt nod to Higgs, who stepped forward and took Elara's arm, his grip like a manacle. There was no gentleness in it, only ownership. As he pulled her away, across the muddy yard towards the path that led to the cluster of wretched hovels where the enslaved workers lived, Elara cast one last look over her shoulder at the manor. Its lit windows, which had once promised warmth and safety, now seemed like the cold, mocking eyes of a beast that had devoured her whole life. The grand door was already closing, shutting her out forever. The first wave of true, gut-wrenching terror finally broke through her defiant resolve, and a single sob escaped her lips, lost in the pattering of the rain. The gilded cage was gone. She was now in the pit. The news of Elara's fall spread through the household and the surrounding village with the swift, silent virulence of a plague. It was not announced, nor proclaimed from the pulpit. It was whispered in the kitchens, muttered in the stables, and passed between neighbors over garden fences with a mixture of shock, grim satisfaction, and a superstitious dread. The Blackwood name, which had always carried a weight of fear and respect, was now tarnished with a scandal of such Gothic proportions that it seemed to suck the very warmth from the autumn air. The daughter of the house, the heiress to Ironwood, had been cast out, stripped of her station, and condemned to live among the very lowest of the low for the sin of loving a slave. It was a tale so shocking it bordered on the mythological, yet it was undeniably true. The first to feel the seismic shift were the household servants. Mrs. Darrow, her face a mask of stricken grief, had been forced to carry out her master's orders, her hands trembling as she helped Elara out of her fine clothes and into the rough linsey-woolsey shift. The sight of the girl she had helped raise from infancy, now shivering in the coarse garment of a penitent or a madwoman, would haunt her for the rest of her days. She tried to offer a few words of comfort, but they stuck in her throat, choked by her own terror of Sir Alistair. When she descended to the servants' hall, her red-rimmed eyes and ashen face told the story before any words were spoken. A horrified silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The footmen and maids exchanged wide-eyed glances. The cook crossed herself. The absolute, unassailable hierarchy that governed their lives had been violently upended. If the master's own daughter could be brought so low, what security did any of them have? This initial shock quickly curdled into a more complex and ugly social phenomenon. Among the lower servants, a sense of grim schadenfreude began to mix with the fear. The fine lady who had never known a day's hardship, who had trailed the scent of lavender and privilege through the halls, was now one of them. No, she was lower than them. She was less than nothing. They saw it as a form of cosmic justice, a leveling of impossible inequalities. They would not dare to mock her openly, not with Sir Alistair's wrath so freshly demonstrated, but in the shadows and in their private conversations, they clucked their tongues and spoke of the dangers of a rebellious spirit and a wanton heart. Pride goeth before a fall, the stern-faced laundry maid was heard to murmur, a sentiment that was quietly echoed by many. Beyond the manor walls, in the village of Ironwood Cross, the news was received with a different kind of fervor. The tenant farmers and tradesmen, who had long resented Sir Alistair's ruthless grip on the valley, found a perverse satisfaction in his humiliation. That his own blood had betrayed him in the most profound way possible was seen as a kind of divine retribution for his cruelties. Yet this satisfaction was tightly bound with a deep, puritanical outrage. For Elara to have consorted with a slave, a heathen from a barbarous land, was an offense against God, against nature, and against the very fabric of their society. It was a pollution of the bloodlines, a sin that threatened the moral order itself. She was not viewed as a tragic heroine, but as a Jezebel, a warning to all their own daughters about the perils of straying from the path of righteousness. The local gentry, those few families who considered themselves peers of the Blackwoods, reacted with a cold, formal horror. Visits to the manor ceased abruptly. Letters went unanswered. Sir Alistair and his disgraced daughter became pariahs. To be associated with such a scandal, even as a sympathetic onlooker, was to risk contamination. Their own social standing, their own daughter's marriage prospects, were at stake. The name Blackwood was quietly scrubbed from invitation lists. The affair was discussed in hushed, scandalized tones in drawing rooms, a dreadful tale from which they all collectively averted their gaze, as one would from a grotesque accident on the roadside. The most profound and isolating reaction, however, came from the church. Parson Albright, a man of weak constitution and weaker will, was placed in an impossible position. Sir Alistair was his most powerful and wealthy parishioner, the patron of the living. To condemn him outright was impossible. Yet the sin was too great to ignore. The following Sunday, his sermon was a masterwork of oblique condemnation. He did not mention the Blackwoods by name, but he spoke at length about the sins of the flesh, the dangers of disobedience, and the sacred hierarchy ordained by God, which placed masters over servants, fathers over daughters, and the civilized over the savage. His eyes swept over the congregation, and though he never looked directly at Sir Alistair, who sat in his accustomed pew, stern and unmoved, the message was clear. Elara's soul was in mortal peril, and her father's house was under a shadow. After the service, the parishioners gave Sir Alistair a wide berth, their greetings stiff and formal. The social death that Sir Alistair had engineered for his daughter was now complete. She was an outcast, a non-person, her name a byword for shame and degradation. The walls of the world had closed in on her as effectively as any prison, and the silence that now surrounded her was more crushing than any physical chain. The stage was set for the final, terrible act of her descent into the abyss that yawned beneath the gilded floors of Ironwood Manor. The slave quarters were not a place Elara had ever truly seen before. She had only ever glimpsed them from a great distance, a smudge of squalor on the edge of the beautiful estate. Now she was thrust into its heart, and the reality of it was a physical blow that stole the breath from her lungs. It was a single, long, low building of crude stone and rotting timber, its roof patched with turf and tarpaulins. The air that wafted from the open doorway was a thick, foul miasma of unwashed bodies, damp earth, disease, and despair. Higgs shoved her inside. The interior was one long room, lit only by a single, smoking tallow lamp that cast a greasy, dancing light over a scene from a medieval vision of hell. Rough-hewn bunks were stacked 3 high along the walls, mere shelves stuffed with moldy straw. The floor was packed earth, muddy and littered with refuse. The faces that turned towards her in the gloom were hollowed by exhaustion and hunger, their eyes reflecting a spectrum of emotions: shock, pity, curiosity, and in a few, a dull, resentful anger. She was an alien creature here, her pale skin and delicate features, even smudged with dirt and rain, marking her as indelibly as a brand. "This is your new home," Higgs sneered, his voice echoing in the stifling space. "Find a space. You'll be woken with the rest." He gave her one last, contemptuous look and left, sliding a heavy wooden bar across the door from the outside, imprisoning her. For a long moment, Elara simply stood, frozen, her back against the rough-hewn wall, the coarse fabric of her shift chafing her skin. The reality of her choice was a cold, heavy stone in her gut. The romantic fantasies of a life with Kael, built in the secret, almost sacred space of the potting shed, evaporated like mist in this reeking, oppressive darkness. This was not a cottage by the sea. This was a charnel house for the living. A low murmur began to ripple through the room. She saw Kael then, rising from a lower bunk in a far corner. He moved towards her slowly, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. The other inhabitants watched, their silence more accusing than any shout. When he reached her, he did not embrace her. He did not take her hand. He simply stood before her, his gaze sweeping over her, from her shivering form in the inadequate shift to the terror in her eyes. "Why you come here?" he asked, his voice a low, rough whisper, devoid of the warmth she had known. It was the voice of a man confronting a catastrophe. I chose you," she stammered, tears now streaming freely down her cheeks, mingling with the rain. "My father, he gave me a choice. To renounce you and stay, or to be with you and share your life. I chose you, Kael. I chose us." He was silent for a long time, his jaw working. She had expected gratitude, perhaps, or a shared, defiant passion. Instead, she saw only a profound weariness, and something that looked frighteningly like anger. "You foolish," he said, the words simple and brutal. "This is not a life to share. This is a death to endure. You do not know what you have done." His words were a second, deeper betrayal. She had given up everything for him, crossed an unimaginable chasm, and his welcome was condemnation. "But our dreams," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Dreams are for free people," he replied, his tone flat and final. He gestured to a top bunk, its straw spilling out from a torn sacking cover. It was next to his own. "That is your place. The sun comes early." He turned away from her and went back to his own bunk, lying down with his back to her. The finality of the gesture was more devastating than any physical blow. The murmuring in the room died down, replaced by the sounds of restless sleep, coughing, muttering, the rustle of straw. Elara stood for a long time, shivering in the cold and the crushing weight of her disillusionment. Eventually, driven by utter exhaustion, she climbed up to the high bunk. The straw prickled and stank. The rough blanket she pulled over herself was alive with lice. She lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of misery around her, the man she loved a silent, unyielding presence just a few feet below. The first, bitter seeds of regret took root in her soul, and she wept silently, the tears soaking into the filthy straw. The door to her old life was barred shut, and the door to her new one had slammed in her face. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Dawn did not arrive at Ironwood. It was dragged, unwillingly, into being by the hoarse, brutal blare of a horn, a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of sleep and hope alike. For Elara, who had finally succumbed to an exhausted, tear-soaked stupor on the prickling, foul-smelling straw of her bunk, the sound was a physical assault. It jolted her into a reality more terrifying than any nightmare. The heavy bar on the door scraped back with a sound of finality, and Higgs's voice roared into the gloomy, suffocating space. "Up! All of you! Move your worthless hides! The master doesn't pay for your slumber." The long room, which had been a tomb of quiet despair, instantly erupted into a frantic, joyless choreography of motion. Bodies, spectral in the pre-dawn grayness, swung down from the tiers of bunks with a weary agility born of long practice. They pulled on ragged, damp clothes and shuffled towards the door where a large, blackened iron pot sat over a feeble fire, a sullen man doling out a thin, watery gruel into wooden bowls. There were no spoons. Elara moved slowly, her limbs leaden with a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight, her muscles screaming in protest from the unaccustomed hardness of her bed and the deep, penetrating cold that had seeped into her bones during the night. The coarse linsey-woolsey shift felt like a suit of sandpaper against her skin, which was already raw and chafed. She joined the end of the line, her head bowed, acutely aware of the sidelong glances and hushed whispers that her presence provoked. She was a spectacle, a fallen angel cast into the pit, and every pair of eyes upon her was a fresh brand of her shame. When she reached the pot, the man serving, a haggard individual with a sunken chest and a perpetual cough, glanced at her. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of something that might have been pity crossed his worn features before it was extinguished by the grim necessity of his own survival. He slopped a ladle of the gray, lumpy porridge into a wooden bowl and thrust it at her. The gruel was unappetizing, tepid, and smelled faintly of smoke, but a gnawing, hollow hunger in her belly, a sensation entirely new and deeply unsettling, compelled her to raise the bowl to her lips as she saw the others doing. The texture was slimy, the taste bland and gritty with bits of husk, but it was warmth, and for a few brief moments, it was the only semblance of comfort she would receive that day. Before she had even finished the meager portion, Higgs was among them again, his presence a dark cloud of menace, his whip cracking against the sodden doorframe for emphasis. "Blackwood," he barked, his piggy eyes finding her instantly in the crowd, as if drawn to her misery. "With the women. To the scullery. And don't think your fine blood will spare you the lash if you're slow." She was herded with a group of a dozen other women, their faces worn and resigned into masks of perpetual endurance, their hands, even in the cold, red and cracked like old leather. They marched in a silent, shivering file towards the main house, not through the grand front entrance she had used all her life, but through a low, arched doorway near the stables that led directly into the steamy, chaotic bowels of the manor, the kitchens. The contrast was so violently disorienting it made her head spin. She had been in this kitchen countless times before, but always as a specter of authority, a fleeting apparition of lace and perfume come to give a quiet order to the cook or to inspect the day's menus with a detached air. Now, she was part of its machinery, another cog to be worn down by its relentless grinding. The heat was immense and oppressive, blasting from the great fireplace where spits heavy with joints of meat turned slowly, dripping fat into the flames with a furious hiss. The air was thick and soupy with the smells of roasting flesh, baking bread, and boiling vegetables, smells that had once promised a pleasant meal in the dining room above, now a taunting, cruel reminder of all she had lost, of the chasm that now separated her from her past life. The head cook, a formidable, broad-beamed woman named Agnes who had once curtsied and called her Miss Elara, with a semblance of deference, now looked at her with a mixture of contempt, grim satisfaction, and a wary fear, as if Elara's disgrace might be catching. "So," Agnes said, her voice a low, rough thing, dripping with a sarcasm that was meant to humiliate, "the fine lady has decided to get her hands dirty at last. We've a mountain of potatoes needs peeling before the midday meal. A sack and a bucket. Get to it. And I'll have no dawdling." She was pointed towards a grimy sack bulging with potatoes, still caked in earth, and a large wooden bucket filled with cold, murky water. A blunt, rusty knife, its edge nicked and dull, was thrust into her hand. She looked at it, then at the mountain of dirty, misshapen tubers. A wave of helplessness washed over her. She had never peeled a potato in her life. She had scarcely even seen one in its raw, earthy state. They had always arrived at the table transformed, mashed and buttered or roasted golden brown. One of the other women, an older one named Bess with a kind, weary face etched with 1,000 lines of hardship, saw her hesitation. Without a word, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of such labor, Bess took a potato and the knife from Elara's limp hand. With swift, efficient motions born of pure necessity, she demonstrated, her own gnarled fingers making the task look deceptively simple. Elara, her cheeks burning with a mixture of shame and frustration, tried to imitate her. Her first attempts were clumsy and pathetic. She cut away great wasteful chunks of the potato, nicked her thumb deeply enough to draw a bright bead of blood, and fumbled the slippery, half-peeled vegetable into the dirty water. The other women watched, some with a passive, weary pity, others with silent, barely concealed mockery. This was their world, and she was an incompetent, unwanted intruder. Agnes strode over, her heavy footsteps shaking the stone flags. She peered into the bucket of poorly peeled, blood-specked potatoes and let out a short, derisive snort. "Useless," she declared loudly, for the benefit of the entire kitchen. "Wasteful. No breakfast tomorrow until you can do it proper. And you'll work through the noon bell to make up for this waste. You'll learn the value of what you once took for granted, my girl." The hours that followed were a new, particular kind of hell, one of monotonous, soul-destroying labor. The damp cold of the scullery seeped into her bones, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the main kitchen. The rusty knife grew impossibly heavy in her aching hand, the small cut on her thumb stinging fiercely with every movement in the dirty water. Her back ached from hunching over the bucket, her neck from the strain. The sheer, mind-numbing monotony of the task, the endless repetition of grab, peel, drop, was a torture her educated, imaginative mind was uniquely unsuited to endure. She was surrounded by the abundance of food, the very essence of the wealth she had been born into, yet her hunger grew, a sharp, painful knot in her stomach. She was in her own home, yet she was an unwelcome intruder, a ghost condemned to toil in the underworld of her former life. At one point, she looked up from her bucket, her vision blurry with unshed tears of frustration and pain, and saw Mary, her former lady's maid, standing in the doorway to the main kitchen, a basket of linens in her arms. Their eyes met. A complex, violent wave of emotion passed over Mary's young face: shock, pity, a deep, instinctive fear, and a desperate, urgent need to not be associated with her, to not share in her fall from grace. It was all there, written as clearly as in a book. Mary's gaze faltered first. She quickly looked down at the stone floor, her cheeks flushing a bright, guilty red, and scurried off back into the kitchen, as if Elara's disgrace were a contagious plague. The small, silent rejection was a fresh, deep wound, another thread connecting her to her old life cleanly severed. When the noon bell finally rang, a sound that once meant nothing to her but now promised a brief respite, the other women set down their tools and left for their meager meal. Elara was forced to stay, alone in the cold, silent scullery, to finish the now soggy, discolored potatoes, her stomach cramping with hunger. When she was finally done, her hands raw and trembling, she was given a single crust of stale bread and a cup of water, and then immediately sent to the laundry, where she spent the remainder of the afternoon stirring vast, boiling vats of linens with a heavy wooden paddle, the scalding steam reddening her face and searing her lungs with every breath. That evening, as she trudged back to the slave quarters in the fading, bruised light of the autumn evening, her body screamed with a myriad of pains she had never known could exist. The romantic, foolish notion of shared hardship had been stripped away, revealing the brutal, grinding, dehumanizing reality beneath. And when she finally collapsed onto her foul-smelling straw pallet, too tired even to weep, too broken to even think, she saw Kael watching her from his bunk across the room. There was no love in his gaze, no comfort, not even shared anger. There was only a grim, unspoken understanding of the hell she had willingly entered, and a silent, heavy accusation that now, she was a burden he had never asked for, a constant, dangerous reminder of the world that held them both in its merciless grip. The gulf between them, once bridged by secret whispers and the tender touch of hands in a dusty shed, was now wider and deeper than ever, filled not with passion, but with the cold, hard, unyielding mud of a reality from which there was no escape. The days bled into one another, each a carbon copy of the last, a relentless cycle of exhaustion, hunger, and degradation. Elara's world shrank to the confines of her aching body and the immediate, brutal tasks set before her. The initial shock wore off, replaced by a dull, grinding ache of existence. Her hands, once soft and white, were now a network of cuts, blisters, and calluses, permanently stained with dirt and potato juice. The fine, delicate bones of her face began to show through skin that was roughened by wind and steam. Her hair, which she had no time or means to properly care for, became a tangled, lank mess, often hidden beneath a coarse cloth. Her education in servitude was thorough and merciless. After the scullery and laundry, she was sent to the ash pit, shoveling the cold, gritty residue from the manor's countless fireplaces. She was tasked with scrubbing the stone floors of the back passages on her hands and knees, the lye-based soap burning her cracked skin. She was sent to the poultry yards to collect eggs, a task that resulted in her being pecked and chased by aggressive geese, much to the amusement of the stable hands. With every task, a part of the lady she had been was systematically scoured away. The social death her father had promised was absolute. The household staff, who had once treated her with deference, now either ignored her completely or addressed her with curt, impersonal commands. She was "you" or "girl," never "Miss Elara." They averted their eyes when she passed, as if the sight of her was unlucky. The local parson, a frequent guest at her father's table, once encountered her carrying a heavy bucket of slops across the yard. He stopped, his mouth agape for a moment, before crossing himself hurriedly and walking on without a word, as if he had seen a ghost. The message was clear: she was no longer part of their world, no longer under God's grace as they understood it. She was an outcast, a moral leper. The only person who showed her any consistent, if silent, kindness was Bess, the woman from the scullery. She would sometimes slip Elara an extra piece of bread or quietly show her a more efficient way to scour a pot. But even this kindness was tempered with a grim pragmatism. "Keep your head down, girl," Bess whispered to her one day as they plucked chickens in the freezing yard. "Don't draw no attention. There's worse than scrubbing floors here." The slave quarters remained a place of profound alienation. The other inhabitants largely kept their distance. Her presence was a disruption, a dangerous anomaly. Some, like Bess, pitied her. Others resented the extra attention her presence drew from Higgs. And a few viewed her with a cold, predatory interest, seeing her vulnerability as an opportunity. She learned to sleep lightly, one hand always clutching the small, sharp knife she had stolen from the kitchen, a paltry defense against the pervasive threat of the night. Her interactions with Kael were the most painful wound of all. They were fleeting and functional, conducted under the watchful eyes of others. He would sometimes help her with a task that was too physically demanding, like lifting a full laundry vat, but he did so without meeting her eyes, his touch impersonal. The man who had whispered his true name to her in the potting shed was gone, replaced by a silent, brooding stranger. The love she had felt for him, the passion that had driven her to this ruin, began to curdle into a confused knot of resentment, longing, and a terrifying, dawning realization. Had she loved the man, or had she loved the romantic idea of him? And had he ever truly loved her, or had she merely been a fleeting distraction, a window into a world he could observe but never enter? One evening, after a day spent mucking out the stables, her body reeking of horse dung and sweat, she found herself standing near him as they waited for the evening gruel. The rain was falling again, a cold, persistent drizzle. She gathered her courage, her voice a hoarse croak from disuse. "Kael," she whispered, so softly only he could hear. He tensed but did not look at her. Do you regret it?" she asked, the question that had been eating at her for weeks finally spilling out. "Us? The shed? Everything?" He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and devoid of emotion, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance. "Regret is a luxury," he said. "Like hope. It is a fire that burns you from the inside. You must let it go. There is only the work. There is only the next day." He moved away then, taking his place in the line, leaving her standing alone in the rain. His words were not an answer, but they were a truth more devastating than any denial. He had not just accepted his chains, he had internalized them, and in doing so, had built a prison within himself that was even more impregnable than the one made of stone and timber. And she, with her foolish, romantic heart, was locked outside of that too. She had given up everything to be with him, only to find that the man she had chosen was no longer there. The tragedy was no longer just about her fall from grace. It was about the death of the love that had caused it, a love that had starved to death in the cold, hard reality of Ironwood. The grim procession of days hardened into a brutal, unyielding reality, a season of despair that seemed to have no end. The autumn gales gave way to the sharp, biting cold of early winter, and the damp that perpetually clung to the valley now carried the threat of frost. For Elara, the cold was a new and exquisite form of torture. The thin, coarse shift and the single, threadbare blanket afforded no protection against the chill that seeped through the crumbling stone walls of the quarters and settled deep into her bones. Her hands, now permanently chapped and raw, developed painful, bleeding cracks at the knuckles. A persistent, racking cough took root in her chest, a cough that would shake her frail frame in the darkness and leave her gasping for breath. The meager rations, which had once been merely insufficient, now felt like a deliberate instrument of slow starvation, the constant, gnawing hunger a dull ache that accompanied every waking moment and haunted her dreams. It was during this period of physical erosion that Sir Alistair decided to formalize her damnation, to stamp it with a seal of such perverse finality that there could be no return, no glimmer of a future that was not entirely of his own malicious design. He summoned her one evening, not to the library where her fate had been sealed, but to his private study, a smaller, more intimate room he used for the most confidential and grim of his affairs. A single, large ledger lay open on the desk, its pages filled with columns of figures that quantified human misery. The fire in the grate burned high and hot, but it offered no warmth to Elara's spirit. It only served to highlight the profound and unbridgeable chasm between the comfort of the master and the suffering of the enslaved. Sir Alistair regarded her as she stood before his desk, her hands clasped in front of her in a futile attempt to stop their trembling, her head bowed not in submission, but to hide the last, dying embers of her spirit that still, against all odds and reason, refused to be fully extinguished. He saw the gauntness of her face, the grime under her broken nails, the way her shoulders hunched against the weight of her existence. There was no pity in his gaze, only a cold, analytical assessment. "You have settled into your new station, I see," he began, his voice devoid of any paternal inflection. It was the tone of a master assessing a piece of machinery that was, against expectation, still functioning. "The reports from Higgs suggest you are marginally less useless than you were. The fiction of your former life is now well and truly buried. The world has forgotten Elara Blackwood. But there remains one last thread to be cut, one last irregularity to be corrected." Elara remained silent, her eyes fixed on the intricate, faded pattern of the Persian rug beneath her worn, muddy clogs. She had learned that any response, any flicker of emotion, would only feed the cold engine of his cruelty. She was a void, and she intended to offer him nothing. Her association with the slave Cain, he continued, lingering on the name he had imposed with deliberate emphasis. It was the root of this corruption. It was an irregularity, a sin against nature, against order, and against my will. Such irregularities cannot be permitted to stand. I intend to correct it. I will make it regular. I will make it lawful after a fashion. He let the words hang in the thick, fire-warmed air, allowing their sinister, incomprehensible implication to take root. Elara's heart, which had learned to beat with a slow, weary rhythm, began to hammer a frantic, terrified tattoo against her ribs. What fresh torment could he possibly devise? "You chose him," Sir Alistair said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes glinting in the firelight like chips of obsidian. "You declared your love for him before me, with a passion you never once showed for your own family or your duty. Very well. You shall have him. You will be joined to him. In marriage." Elara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a disbelief so profound it felt like a physical disorientation. Marriage? The word was a choked, strangled whisper. The sacred union of the church, the foundation of society, the bond her own mother had entered, he was twisting it into this grotesque parody. It was a blasphemy that stole the very air from the room. A marriage, he confirmed, a thin, cruel smile stretching his lips, a sight more terrifying than any shout of rage. Conducted by Parson Albright. He owes me a considerable debt, and his scruples, while tedious, have their price. It will be done in the old chapel at midnight. It will be legally binding. You will be his wife. His property, as he is mine. The circle will be complete. Your romantic fantasy will be made manifest, and you will live within its truth for the rest of your days. This was a refinement of cruelty she had not anticipated, a move so diabolical it left her mind reeling. He was not just punishing her, he was sanctifying her punishment. He was taking the last, sacred vestige of her romantic dream, a union with Kael blessed by God, and defiling it, turning it into the heaviest chain of all, one that would bind her even more tightly to this hell, a chain endorsed by scripture and law. A marriage under God's eye, but orchestrated by the devil in this very room. You cannot, she breathed, but the protest died, withered by the absolute certainty in his gaze. She knew he could. He was Sir Alistair Blackwood. In this valley, his word was law, and God, it seemed, was a silent, complicit partner, his representative bought and paid for. The ceremony is set for tomorrow night, he stated, his final word on the matter. You will be cleaned up for the occasion. It would not do for a Blackwood to be wed looking like a scullery maid, even in a farce such as this. He waved a dismissive hand as if swatting a fly. Higgs, take her back. Ensure the other one is informed. That night, in the foul-smelling, coughing darkness of the quarters, she found a moment to stand near Kael. The others were already asleep or lost in their own private miseries, their ragged breathing a discordant chorus of exhaustion. The cold was so intense she could see her own breath, a ghostly plume in the sliver of moonlight coming through a crack in the wall. My father, she whispered, her voice a trembling, frozen thing. He means for us to be married. Tomorrow. By the parson. In the old chapel. Kael, who had been sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at nothing, stilled completely. In the faint, ethereal light, she saw the hard line of his jaw tighten, the muscles in his forearms cord. He did not look at her. I know, he said, his voice a low, resigned rumble, like distant thunder. You know. The shock was a physical blow, a fresh betrayal that stole what little warmth remained in her body. Higgs told me. This afternoon. He said it is the master's will. A lesson. A joke. And you accept it? She asked, a desperate, futile hope rising in her that he would rage against this, that he would see it for the profound blasphemy it was, that some of the man from the potting shed would re-emerge to defy this final indignity. He was silent for a long, agonizing time, a silence filled with the weight of their shared and separate despairs. When he finally spoke, his words were like stones dropping into a deep, frozen well, creating ripples of absolute finality. What is there to accept? What is there to refuse? It changes nothing. It is just another chain. A paper chain. We are already in the cage. Does it matter if the lock has a pretty name? He owns the church. He owns the law. He owns us. This is just him writing his name on what he already possesses. He lay down then, turning his back to her, pulling his thin blanket over his shoulders. The conversation was over. His resignation was more terrifying than any anger could have been. He saw this not as a perversion of a sacred right, but as an inevitable, logical conclusion to their status as property. The marriage would not unite them, it would merely codify their mutual entrapment, make a public record of their private hell. The last flicker of hope within her, the fragile, foolish belief that their love could somehow, in some small, secret way, transcend their circumstances, guttered and died, extinguished by the cold wind of his acquiescence. She was to be married. It was to be the darkest, most hollow night of her life, a ceremony that would mock the very concept of love, faith, and freedom. She climbed to her bunk, the cold straw offering no comfort, and stared into the darkness, waiting for the midnight hour that would seal her fate not as a bride, but as a condemned soul. The old chapel stood a quarter-mile from the manor, a small, Norman-built structure of crumbling stone that had been long since superseded by the grander church in the village. It was a place of shadows and silence, its air thick with the dust of forgotten prayers and the chill of neglect. On the night appointed for the ceremony, a fitful moon struggled through ragged, swift-moving clouds, casting a sickly, intermittent light on the overgrown path that led to its door. An owl hooted from a skeletal oak, the sound a mournful dirge for the sacrilege about to take place. Inside, the scene was one of Gothic surrealism, a tableau staged by a malevolent puppeteer. A few thick, tallow candles, their flames guttering and dancing in the drafts that whistled through cracked window panes, provided the only illumination, pushing back the darkness just enough to reveal the ancient stone altar and the grim, pale faces of the participants, their features distorted by the shifting shadows. Elara stood before the altar, feeling like a specter at her own funeral, a participant in a play whose script was written in despair. Mrs. Darrow, under strict and humiliating orders, had indeed cleaned her up. She had been made to wash in icy water and then forced into a dress that was a cruel and poignant mockery of a wedding gown. It was an old, yellowed gown of her mother's, from a fashion 2 decades past, musty and far too large for Elara's emaciated frame. It hung on her, a shroud of past elegance and lost happiness, its once fine lace now frayed and smelling overwhelmingly of camphor and decay. In her numb, cold hands, she clutched a pathetic bunch of wilted, bedraggled meadow flowers and thorny brambles, picked by Higgs from the frozen ditch beside the road. Across from her stood Kael. He had been given a clean but coarse, unbleached linen shirt and a pair of dark trousers that were too short for him, revealing his ankles above his crude boots. He stood with his shoulders squared, not in pride, but with the rigid posture of a soldier facing a firing squad, his face an impenetrable, expressionless mask, his eyes fixed on the stone floor as if he could bore a hole through it and escape into the earth below. He looked like a man being prepared for a ritual sacrifice, not a groom at the altar. Parson Albright stood between them, his face pale and beaded with a nervous sweat that gleamed in the candlelight, his hands trembling so violently that the pages of the prayer book rustled like dead leaves. He was a thin, nervous man, his conscience clearly warring with his fear of Sir Alistair and the crushing weight of his financial debts. He kept darting quick, furtive glances towards the back of the chapel, where Sir Alistair himself stood, shrouded in the deepest shadows, watching the proceedings with the detached, analytical air of a scientist conducting a morbid and conclusive experiment. He was flanked by Higgs, whose expression was one of brutish, undisguised amusement, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. The parson began to speak, his voice thin and reedy, stumbling over the sacred, familiar words as if they were written in a foreign tongue. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God." The hallowed phrase rang utterly hollow in the desolate, unconsecrated space, a lie told in the face of the cold stones. This was not God's sight, this was Sir Alistair's theatre of cruelty, and they were all unwilling players. Elara barely heard the words. They washed over her, a meaningless, droning litany. She felt utterly disconnected from her own body, watching the scene from a great, cold height, a witness to her own spiritual execution. When the parson, his voice quavering, asked, "Wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband?" there was a long, terrible silence broken only by the moan of the wind in the eaves. Sir Alistair cleared his throat, a soft, menacing sound that echoed in the tense quiet. Elara's lips moved, but no sound came out. She felt a vast, invisible pressure, the weight of her father's will and the utter hopelessness of her situation, forcing her consent from a place beyond her own will. "I will," she whispered, the words tasting of dust and ashes, a confession of defeat. The question was put to Kael. "Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife?" He did not hesitate. His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion, a simple, stark statement of fact. "I will." It was the tone he might use to confirm that a trench had been dug or a load carried. There was no love in it, no hope, not even resentment. It was the sound of absolute surrender, the final extinguishing of a spirit. The parson, rushing now to be done with the sacrilege, his face slick with sweat, hurried through the rest of the service, mangling the beautiful language of the liturgy in his haste. He pronounced them man and wife. There was no ring, no kiss, no blessing. They simply stood, two lost souls bound together not by love or devotion, but by the cold, vindictive will of a tyrant, in a union that mocked the very institution it purported to honor. Sir Alistair stepped forward from the shadows, moving into the shaky circle of candlelight. A faint, chilling smile played upon his lips. "Congratulations," he said, the word a venomous dart aimed at both their hearts. "You are now one flesh. You may return to your quarters. Your duties await you at first light. Do not be late." There was no feast, no celebration, no shared cup. The grotesque ceremony was over. Higgs gestured sharply for them to leave. As they filed out of the chapel into the biting cold of the night, Elara chanced a look at Kael. His profile in the intermittent moonlight was sharp and unyielding as flint. He did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. The man who was now, by law and church, her husband, walked beside her as a complete and utter stranger, the gulf between them now officially sanctified and sealed. The door of the chapel closed behind them with a heavy, final thud, shutting away the flickering candles and the trembling, compromised parson, leaving them alone in the vast, cold, dark night, bound for all eternity to a shared damnation. The wedding ring, a crude, cold band of base metal that Higgs had shoved onto her finger, felt like a manacle, colder and heavier than any iron. She was now, irrevocably and in the eyes of the world, the Ironwood bride. The days that followed the perverse wedding ceremony did not bring any change to the external realities of their existence. The horns still blasted them from their restless sleep before dawn, the gruel was still thin and tasteless, the labor was still back-breaking and endless. Yet, something profound and terrible had shifted within the fragile, fractured dynamic between Elara and Kael. The legal and spiritual bond forced upon them by Sir Alistair's twisted will did not forge a connection. Instead, it erected a final, impenetrable wall between their souls. They were now husband and wife in the eyes of God and the law, a fact that made their utter emotional estrangement a constant, gnawing agony for Elara. Before the ceremony, there had been, if not hope, then at least the ghost of the passion they had once shared, a secret history that existed in the stolen moments in the potting shed. Now, that history felt like a story she had read about two other people, a foolish and tragic romance that had no bearing on the grim reality of her present. Kael retreated into a silence more profound and absolute than any he had maintained before. He worked, he ate, he slept, but he was a man hollowed out, his spirit seemingly extinguished. He no longer even acknowledged her with a glance. When their tasks brought them into proximity, he moved around her as if she were a piece of furniture. His touch, when required to lift something heavy together, was as impersonal as stone. Elara, in her exhaustion and despair, tried once more to bridge the chasm. It was a fortnight after the wedding, on a rare afternoon when a weak, watery sun broke through the perpetual gray. They had been assigned to clear a blocked drainage ditch on the far edge of the estate, a task that involved standing in icy, knee-deep water, hauling out clumps of rotten vegetation and thick, black mud. Higgs had left them to it, confident in the sheer misery of the labor to keep them in line. For hours, they worked in silence, the only sounds their labored breathing and the suck of mud. As the light began to fade, painting the marsh in shades of purple and gray, Elara could bear the silence no longer. "Kael," she said, her voice raw from the cold air. He continued digging, his powerful shoulders driving the shovel into the muck with a relentless rhythm. "Please," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. "Speak to me. We are married now. We are bound together. Must we live the rest of our lives as strangers? As ghosts sharing a tomb?" He paused then, leaning on his shovel, his chest heaving. He did not look at her, but stared out across the desolate fens, where tendrils of evening mist were beginning to coil like serpents. "What is there to say?" he asked, his voice flat and weary. "The words are all dead. They died in that chapel." "Our words don't have to be dead," she cried, a desperate passion infusing her tone. "We can still have what we had in the shed. We can keep it alive inside us. It is all we have." Finally, he turned his head, and the look in his eyes made her blood run cold. It was not anger, nor hatred. It was a pity so profound it was akin to contempt. The shed was a dream, he said, each word deliberate and heavy. A foolish dream. You dreamed of a prince. I dreamed of a window. A window out of this hell. But it was only a window. I could look, but I could not go through. And you jumped through it, thinking you were coming to me. But you only fell into the hell beside me. You made your hell mine. The truth of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had been so consumed by her own romantic narrative, her own sacrifice, that she had never truly considered the burden it placed upon him. She had not freed him, she had chained herself to him, and in doing so, had doubled his misery. He had lost the one thing he had managed to preserve, his inner world, his private defiance. Her presence was a constant, painful reminder of the fantasy that had doomed them both. "So you blame me," she said, her voice a broken whisper. "I do not have the strength for blame," he replied, turning back to his work, driving the shovel into the mud with a final, decisive thrust. "There is only strength for the work. For the next breath. Do not ask me for more. There is no more." He pulled a heavy clump of roots from the water and tossed it onto the bank, the gesture one of utter finality. The conversation was over. The last bridge was burned. Elara stood shivering in the icy water, the cold seeping through her skin and into her soul. She had lost everything, her home, her name, her station, her father, and now, definitively and irrevocably, the love of the man for whom she had sacrificed it all. She was truly alone, a wife in name only, bound forever to a man who regarded her as the architect of his final, complete imprisonment. The darkness of the oncoming night felt like a physical presence, settling into the empty spaces where her heart and her hopes had once been. There was nothing left but the work, the next breath, and the long, slow, agonizing wait for death. The deep winter clamped its iron grip upon Ironwood, and with it came a new, more insidious form of torment. Sir Alistair, observing the grim tableau of his daughter's existence with the cold eye of a naturalist studying a dying specimen, decided that the lesson required further refinement. The mere drudgery of labor, the social ostracism, the hollow marriage, these were potent punishments, but they lacked a certain poetic symmetry. He sought to complete the circle of her damnation, to turn the very object of her rebellion into the instrument of her final breaking. It began subtly. Higgs, acting on orders delivered in the privacy of the study, started to find fault not with Elara directly, but with Kael for her perceived shortcomings. They were tasked with moving a pile of stone for a new wall. Elara, her strength flagging in the bitter cold, could not lift the heavier pieces. "Can your woman not pull her weight, Kane?" Higgs had snarled, his whip cracking near Kael's boots. "See that she does. Or you'll both feel the lash." Kael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He began to work faster, taking on the heavier stones himself, a silent, resentful fury radiating from him. Elara, shamed and helpless, could only watch as he strained under loads meant for two. The pattern repeated and escalated. When Elara, her hands numb with cold, fumbled and dropped a bucket of water, it was Kael who was denied his evening meal for failing to control his property. When she stumbled on the icy path, slowing their progress to the timber yard, it was Kael who received a sharp, stinging blow from Higgs's cane across his shoulders. "Teach her to keep up," was the constant, venomous refrain. The intention was diabolically clear. Sir Alistair was forcing Kael into the role of overseer, of disciplinarian. He was making him complicit in her suffering, transforming the man she loved into another source of her pain. The fragile, silent truce that had existed between them, born of shared misery, now shattered under this new pressure. One evening, after a day where Kael had been forced to do the work of 3 men to compensate for Elara's failing strength, the tension broke. They were in the quarters, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies. Elara, trembling with exhaustion, accidentally knocked over the small wooden cup of water she had been saving. It was the final straw. Kael turned on her, his eyes, for the first time in months, blazing with a raw, undiluted fury. It was not the cold anger of before, but a hot, desperate rage. "Can you do nothing right?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. cutting through the ambient noise of the hut. Must your clumsiness cost me my food? My skin? Is your foolishness never at an end? Elara flinched as if struck. It was an accident, she stammered, tears springing to her eyes. Everything with you is an accident, he shot back, stepping closer, his large frame looming over her. Your love was an accident that destroyed us both. Your presence here is an accident that doubles my burden every day. I have enough whips on my back without you adding to them with your weakness. The words were like shards of glass. They laid bare the bitter truth he had kept locked away. He did not see her as a fellow victim, but as the primary cause of his amplified torment. I gave up everything for you, she whispered, her voice thick with a pain deeper than any physical wound. You gave me nothing but more chains, he roared, the sound raw and guttural, causing others in the quarters to look away, uncomfortable. You think your sacrifice was a gift? It was a curse. You were a bird who longed for the cage, and now you weep because the bars are cold. You have no idea what true suffering is, and your romantic folly has made you an anchor around my neck, dragging us both deeper. He turned away from her, his shoulders heaving with ragged breaths, the anger seeming to drain from him as quickly as it had come, leaving only a bottomless well of despair. Elara stood frozen, his words echoing in the hollowed-out chamber of her soul. He was right. She had been a fool. She had seen a tragic romance where there was only a brutal power dynamic. She had thought her love could conquer all, but it had only provided her father with the perfect weapon to destroy them both. From that night on, a new, terrible distance opened between them, wider than any that had come before. It was no longer just silence, it was active hostility. Kael's eyes, when they chanced to meet hers, were no longer empty. They were full of a cold, sharp blame. He no longer helped her with her tasks. If she struggled, he let her struggle. If Higgs threatened punishment for her failings, Kael would simply stand, stoic and silent, accepting the blows, his gaze fixed on her with an accusatory intensity that was worse than any lash. He was being broken, and he was making certain she watched, making certain she knew she was the reason. The love that had once been their secret solace had now mutated into a poison, and they were both dying from its bitter sting. The winter deepened, and with it, the final act of Sir Alistair's grim theatre began to take shape. The hostility that now defined the space between Elara and Kael had become a tangible force, a third presence in their shared damnation. It was a coldness more penetrating than the frost that rimed the inside of the slave quarters each morning, a silence more profound than the hush that fell over the frozen fens. Kael's blame was no longer a sporadic outburst. It had settled into a constant, unspoken accusation in his every glance, in his deliberate avoidance, in his resigned acceptance of the punishments her weakness incurred. Sir Alistair observed this development not with satisfaction, but with the calm assurance of a chess player who has foreseen the final checkmate. The pieces were moving exactly as he had intended. The slave was broken, his spirit not just subdued but twisted into a tool. The daughter was a hollowed-out wreck, her body failing, her mind adrift in a sea of regret. Yet, for the master of Ironwood, this was not enough. The lesson required a final, indelible punctuation. The sin of defiance demanded an ultimate price, one that would echo through the local lore for generations, a permanent warning against challenging the natural order. He summoned Higgs to his study on a night when the wind screamed around the manor like a chorus of the damned. The fire roared, but could not dispel the deep chill that Sir Alistair seemed to carry with him. The farce is nearing its end, Higgs, Sir Alistair stated, his voice devoid of any emotion save for a cold, final resolve. The girl is a drain. Her continued presence is a reminder of an imperfection I intend to erase. She is sickly, weak, and her spirit is broken. There is no more sport to be had, no further lesson to be taught. She is simply refuse. Higgs shifted his weight, his brutish face unreadable. Shall I have the men take her to the marshes, sir? A fever can take a body quickly this time of year. Sir Alistair gave a slow, negative shake of his head. No, that would be too simple, too clean. The consequence must be proportional. It must complete the circle. He leaned forward, his flint-like eyes pinning Higgs in place. He chose her. She chose him. Their fates are intertwined. Therefore, he will be the one to sever the knot. A flicker of understanding, mixed with a primal unease, crossed Higgs's features. The slave, sir? Kael. Precisely, Sir Alistair confirmed. You will give him the order. He is to take her into the deep marshes tonight and be done with it. He is not to return until it is finished. And if he refuses? Higgs asked, though he already knew the answer. Sir Alistair's smile was a thin, cruel line. He will not refuse. He is already a dead man walking. This is merely the final confirmation. He understands the cost of disobedience. And he has come to hate her almost as much as I do. This will be a release for him as much as a punishment. See that it is done. Later that night, as a freezing rain began to fall, turning the world to a sheet of black ice, Higgs came to the slave quarters. He did not call for Elara. Instead, he went straight to Kael's bunk and kicked the frame, the sound like a gunshot in the tense quiet. The master has a task for you. Kael rose slowly, his movements heavy with a dread that seemed to emanate from his very bones. He followed Higgs out into the lashing rain. They stood just outside the door, the wind whipping their words away from the listening walls. The girl, Higgs said, his voice a low growl. She's a problem that needs solving. You're to take her into the heart of the marsh tonight. The deep part by the standing stones. You know the place. You're to take her there and be rid of her. Do not return to the quarters until it is done. The master's orders. There was a long, suspended silence, filled only by the howl of the storm. Kael stood motionless, the rain plastering his shirt to his powerful frame. He did not look at Higgs. His gaze was turned inward, towards an abyss that had been waiting for him all his life. He did not ask why. He did not protest. He did not plead. The command was simply the final, logical step in the journey that had begun the day he was taken from his home. It was the ultimate expression of his bondage, the final destruction of his soul. He was to murder the woman who was, by law, his wife. The woman whose love for him had been the catalyst for this entire tragedy. He gave a single, slow nod. Good, Higgs grunted, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. He handed Kael a heavy, sharpened piece of iron, a crude tool from the smithy that could serve as a weapon or a digging implement. Get it done. Higgs turned and lumbered back towards the dry warmth of the overseer's hut, leaving Kael standing alone in the freezing, merciless dark. The order hung in the air around him, a shroud from which there was no escape. He was to be the executioner of his own doomed romance, the final instrument of Sir Alistair's vengeance. The circle was indeed complete. Kael stood motionless in the lashing rain, the crude iron tool cold and heavy in his hand. It was not the weight of the metal that anchored him to the spot, but the colossal, suffocating weight of the command. The wind screamed, tearing at his clothes, but it was a distant sensation, muffled by the roaring silence within his own mind. The abyss he had felt circling him for months had finally opened at his feet, and he was being commanded to step into it, to pull another down with him. He re-entered the slave quarters. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp bodies and despair. A few eyes opened, glinting in the near-total darkness, sensing a shift in the night's terrible rhythm. He walked to Elara's bunk. She was not asleep. She lay on her side, curled into a tight ball, her body racked by the shivering that had become her constant companion. Her eyes were open, two pools of liquid darkness, reflecting what little light there was. She watched him approach, her breath catching in her throat. He did not speak. He simply reached down and took her arm. His grip was not brutal, but it was implacable, devoid of any human warmth. It was the grip of a man performing a function. Elara resisted instinctively, a feeble pull against his strength. Kael? What is it? Come, he said, the single word a hollow echo. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through the numb haze of her exhaustion. This was different. This was not Higgs coming to mete out punishment. This was her husband, the man whose name she had fought to learn, whose love she had sacrificed her world for, pulling her from her pallet in the dead of a storm-swept night. His silence was of a new and terrifying quality. He pulled her to her feet. She was so weak she stumbled against him, but he did not steady her. He merely adjusted his grip and began to walk, pulling her towards the door. She clutched at his arm with her free hand, her fingers finding no purchase on the wet fabric of his sleeve. "Kael, please. Where are you taking me? It's the middle of the night." He did not answer. He unbarred the door and pushed it open, the wind immediately tearing it from his grasp and slamming it against the outer wall. The storm rushed in, a blast of freezing rain and fury. He pulled her out into it. The world outside was a chaos of blackness and stinging water. The path was a river of mud. Elara, barefoot and clad only in her thin, sodden shift, cried out as the cold seized her. "Kael, stop. I'm begging you." He walked on, his stride relentless, dragging her behind him like a sack of grain. The rain blinded her, the wind stole her breath. She stumbled and fell to her knees in the icy mud, a sob tearing from her chest. He stopped, but only for a moment, his grip tightening on her arm as he hauled her back to her feet. There was no pity in the action, only a grim, terrible necessity. They left the relative shelter of the estate buildings behind and struck out across the open fields towards the vast, trackless marshes that bordered the Blackwood lands. This was the direction of the Standing Stones, a place of ancient, pagan dread where even the gamekeepers would not go after dark. The reality of their destination began to dawn on her, a horror so absolute it momentarily stilled her struggles. He was taking her to the marshes. In this storm. With a purpose. "No," she whispered, the word lost in the wind. Then, louder, a scream ripped from the depths of her soul. "Kael, what are you doing?" He stopped then, turning to face her. In a flash of lightning that illuminated the world in a stark, blinding white, she saw his face. It was not the face of the man who had whispered his true name to her in the potting shed. It was not even the face of the resentful, broken husband of the past months. It was a mask of stone, his eyes empty pools, his features set in lines of absolute finality. In that lightning flash, she saw the heavy, sharpened iron in his other hand. The truth crashed down upon her, more crushing than the storm. This was not a walk. This was an execution. And he was the executioner. Her father. It could only be her father's will. The final, perfect punishment. The ultimate lesson. The man she had chosen was to be the instrument of her death. Her terror transformed then, melting in the white-hot furnace of a final, devastating clarity. The struggle went out of her. The sobs ceased. She stood before him in the howling dark, her body trembling violently, but her voice, when it came, was eerily calm. "He ordered you to do this, didn't he?" she said, her words clear and sharp, cutting through the rain. "My father." Kael did not respond. He simply stood, a dark monolith against the raging night, his silence a confirmation more damning than any word. A strange, hollow laugh escaped her lips. "Of course, it is the final piece. The masterpiece of his revenge." She looked up at him, and in the subsequent flashes of lightning, her eyes held his, no longer pleading, but filled with a profound, soul-shattering pity. "And you will do it. You will carry this with you for the rest of your life. This is the final chain he has forged for you. It is heavier than all the others." She took a shaky step forward, her bare feet sinking into the cold mud. "You were right, Kael. In the ditch. I was a fool. I saw a prince. I saw a dream. I did not see the man. And my foolish dream has destroyed us both." She reached out a trembling hand, not to strike him, but to gently touch the cold, wet skin of his arm. "I am sorry. I am so sorry I loved you." Her apology, given in the face of her own murder, was the final, unbearable weight. It broke through the stone mask of his resolve. A shudder ran through his powerful frame, and a low, agonized sound, like that of a wounded animal, was torn from his throat. The iron tool fell from his grasp, sinking silently into the deep mud at their feet. For a long moment, they stood there, two lost souls at the edge of the world, connected by a touch in the midst of the storm. The wind screamed its outrage, the rain lashed their faces like a million tiny whips, but in that moment, There was only the terrible, tragic silence between them. Then Kael moved. But not towards her. He released her arm. He turned his back on her, his shoulders slumping as if under an immense, invisible burden. He took a step, then another, away from her, away from the standing stones, and vanished into the sheeting rain, leaving Elara alone, shivering and utterly abandoned, at the threshold of the treacherous marsh. He had not carried out the order. But in his refusal, he had delivered her to a fate that was, in its own way, just as certain. He had left her to the mercy of the storm and the marsh, and the cold that was already seeping into her bones, claiming her for its own. For a long time, Elara stood motionless, the freezing rain needling her skin, the mud sucking greedily at her bare feet. The space where Kael had vanished remained an empty void in the sheeting darkness, a testament to his final, agonized abandonment. The shock of his departure was a different kind of cold, one that started deep within her soul and spread outwards, numbing her to the physical torment of the storm. He had not killed her with the iron tool, but he had killed the last, faint ember of hope she hadn't even known she still possessed. He had left her to die. The wind, now unbroken by his body, slammed into her with renewed force, knocking her off balance. She stumbled, falling to her hands and knees in the icy water that pooled across the path to the marsh. The shock of the immersion jolted her back into a terrible awareness. She could not stay here. To remain was to surrender, to lie down and let the cold claim her, to become just another piece of detritus washed away by the winter storm. A primal instinct, a will to survive that had been beaten and starved but not entirely extinguished, flickered within her. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she pushed herself upright. Her body screamed in protest, every muscle aching, her lungs burning with each ragged breath. She turned her back on the direction Kael had taken, away from the deep marshes and the standing stones. There was nowhere to go. The manor was a fortress of her torment, the slave quarters a prison. The village would offer no sanctuary, she was an outcast, a ghost. But to move was to exist, and for now that was all she had. She began to walk, not towards anything, but away. Away from the place of her intended execution. Her progress was a pathetic, shambling thing. The frozen ground and sharp stones lacerated her feet, leaving smears of blood in the mud that were instantly washed away by the rain. The thin, soaked shift clung to her like a second skin of ice, offering no protection from the wind that seemed to find every inch of her exposed flesh. The world had shrunk to the next painful step, and the next, and the next. She did not know how long she walked. Time lost all meaning in the featureless, storm-racked dark. The landscape around her was a monochrome of black and gray, the skeletal shapes of trees looming suddenly out of the rain before vanishing again. She stumbled through frozen ditches, clawed her way up slippery banks, her breath coming in short, white plumes that were instantly torn away. The cold was no longer just a sensation. It was a presence, a predatory entity that was slowly, methodically claiming her. It seeped into her bones, making her movements clumsy and slow. A deep, penetrating lethargy began to wrap itself around her mind, whispering promises of peace if she would just stop, just rest for a moment. Just lie down, the cold whispered. The pain will end. The shame will be gone. No more hunger. No more blows. No more of Kael's accusing eyes. It was a seductive thought. To give up. To let the storm do what her father had ordained and her husband had failed to do. It would be so easy. But then a memory surfaced, not of Kael, but of her mother. A faint, ghostly image of a woman with a kind, sad smile, brushing her hair before the fire in her old chamber, humming a soft lullaby. It was a memory from a life so distant it felt like a dream, a memory of warmth and safety and a love that had not been conditional or destructive. That memory, fragile as a soap bubble, became a talisman against the cold's seductive whisper. She forced one foot in front of the other. She would not give her father the satisfaction. She would not die like a stray dog in a ditch on his command. If she was to die, it would be on her terms, fighting until the very last spark of life was gone. The terrain began to change. The fields gave way to thicker woodland, the trees offering a slight respite from the lashing wind, but also deepening the darkness. Brambles tore at her legs and arms, adding fresh, stinging cuts to her collection of miseries. Her shivering became uncontrollable, violent tremors that threatened to shake her apart. The world began to swim in and out of focus, the trees swaying in a dizzying dance. She found herself at the edge of a fast-flowing stream, swollen by the rains, its waters black and churning. There was no way across. It was a dead end. The last of her strength deserted her. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the frozen leaf litter, her body curling instinctively into a ball against the cold. The will to fight drained from her, leaving only a vast, empty exhaustion. She was so tired, so very, very tired. As consciousness began to fray at the edges, her mind, starved and delirious, conjured one final, cruel vision. Not of Kael, nor of her father, but of the wooden bird he had carved for her. She saw it perfectly, resting on the palm of her hand in the dusty potting shed, a symbol of a connection that had felt so real, so true. She had kept it hidden, a secret treasure, long after all other comforts had been stripped away. Where was it now? Thrown away. Like she had been. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime and rain on her cheek before freezing almost instantly. It was the last feeling she registered before the darkness at the edge of her vision rushed in, swallowing the world whole. The cold finally won. The shivering stopped. A strange, deceptive warmth began to spread through her limbs, a final, fatal trick of the body giving up its struggle. Elara Blackwood, the Ironwood bride, lay still in the frozen woods, the storm raging impotently over her silent, broken form. She had escaped her executioner, only to be claimed by the indifferent brutality of the elements. Her rebellion was over. The storm raged through the night, a fury of wind and ice that seemed to scour the very land clean. When dawn finally broke, it was a sullen, gray affair, the light leaching slowly into a world encased in a glassy shell of freezing rain. The trees stood as crystalline sentinels, their branches bowed under the weight of the ice, and a deathly silence had fallen, broken only by the occasional crack of an overloaded limb. It was in this sepulchral quiet that a search party of 2 gamekeepers, sent out by a tersely worded order from Sir Alistair, found her. They were not looking for a living woman. They were seeking a body, a piece of problematic property to be discreetly retrieved and disposed of. They followed the faint, almost obliterated trail of stumbled footsteps and the occasional dark smudge on the ice that might have been blood, leading them away from the deep marshes and into the woods near the swollen stream. They found her curled on her side, partially sheltered by the bare roots of a great oak, her skin waxy and pale as marble, her lips tinged with blue. The thin, frozen shift was a shroud of ice, fused to her skin. One of the men, a younger fellow named John, crossed himself hurriedly, his breath pluming in the cold air. The other, an older, grim-faced keeper named Maddock, simply grunted. "Found her," he said, his voice flat. He nudged her shoulder with his boot. There was no response, no sign of life. "Gone, I'd say. The cold's taken her." John knelt, his fingers going reluctantly to the side of her neck, feeling for a pulse he was certain he would not find. The skin was deathly cold. He held his breath, waiting. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, the faintest, most thready flutter, a whisper of life so fragile it was like a spider's thread, touched his fingertips. He jerked his hand back as if burned. "Matt, she's alive," he whispered, his eyes wide with a superstitious dread. "By God, she's still alive." Maddock's face tightened. This complicated things. A body was one thing, a dying girl was another. He knelt as well, his own thick, calloused fingers confirming the terrible truth. A pulse, so slow and weak it was barely there, but a pulse nonetheless. The cold had not yet finished its work. "We can't leave her," John said, his voice tight with a pity that felt dangerous in this context. "We're not meant to find her alive," Maddock replied, his voice low. "The order was to find her. This changes nothing. She won't last the walk back. But we have to try." John insisted, looking at the pitiful, frozen figure. She was so young. He had seen her from a distance, riding side-saddle in a fine blue habit, a lifetime ago. The memory made her current state all the more horrifying. Maddox sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. He knew the consequences of disobeying Sir Alistair's implicit commands. But he also knew he could not outright murder a girl by leaving her to die. Fine. We'll take her back. But don't expect thanks. For any of us. They fashioned a crude litter from branches and their coats, handling her frozen, stiff body with a rough, impersonal efficiency. The journey back to the manor was a slow, grim procession through the ice-locked world. When they arrived at the back courtyard, their arrival caused a stir among the few servants braving the cold. Mrs. Darrow emerged, her hand flying to her mouth at the sight. "Take her to the empty room off the kitchen," Maddox ordered, his tone brooking no argument. "The one with the stone floor. And send for the doctor. Though God knows what he can do." Elara was carried not to the slave quarters, but to a small, stone-flagged storage room, little more than a closet, usually used for root vegetables. A pallet was thrown on the floor, and she was laid upon it, a heap of frozen, breathing ruin. The household doctor was summoned, a dour man who examined her with a clinical detachment. He confirmed the severe hypothermia, the frostbite that had likely claimed parts of her fingers and toes, the deep congestion in her lungs that promised a swift and fatal pneumonia. "She will not last the day," he pronounced to Sir Alistair, who had descended to the kitchen to witness the conclusion of his drama. "The body has been too badly stressed. There is nothing to be done but make her comfortable." Sir Alistair looked down at his daughter. Her hair was a matted tangle, her face gaunt and marked by hardship, her body broken. There was no triumph in his gaze, only a cold, final assessment. The problem was resolving itself. See that she is kept warm. Give her whatever she needs. I will not have it said she was denied comfort at the end. It was a command for the sake of appearances, a final, hollow gesture. He then turned to Higgs. "And the slave?" "Kane. Returned to the quarters before dawn, sir," Higgs reported. "Said nothing. The tool was missing." Sir Alistair's lips thinned. So, the slave had failed in his ultimate task. He had possessed neither the will to kill her nor the strength to save her. He was truly, utterly broken. A useless tool. Double his workload. See that he is assigned to the deep mine. I do not wish to lay eyes upon him again. Back in the cold, dark storage room, as a fire was hastily lit in the kitchen hearth to warm some stones to place around her, Elara drifted in a gray, painless limbo. She was unaware of the hushed voices, of the rough hands wrapping her in blankets, of the pitying and fearful glances. She was suspended between life and death, the storm still raging in her lungs, the cold having sunk so deep into her core that the warmth of the room could not reach it. She had been found, but she was not saved. She had been brought back to the manor, but she was not home. She was a ghost in the machine of Ironwood, waiting for the last, inevitable release. Her body had been retrieved, but her life was already over. The news, as it always did at Ironwood, traveled not as a proclamation but as a contagion, a whisper of doom that seeped through the cracks under doors and coiled through the servants' halls. She had been found. She was alive, but barely. She was not expected to last the day. The knowledge landed like a stone in the stagnant pond of the estate's daily life, creating ripples of grim finality. In the slave quarters, the air grew heavier, the silence more profound. The men avoided looking at Kael, but their averted eyes were a louder accusation than any shout. He had gone out with her in the storm and returned alone. He had failed in his task, whatever it had been, and now the master's daughter was dying in a root cellar. His fate, and hers, were now sealed in the most terrible way. Kael himself sat on the edge of his bunk, the same bunk he had occupied for years, and felt the world dissolve around him. The stone mask he had worn for so long had cracked in the marsh, and now it fell away entirely, leaving behind a raw, exposed nerve of agony. He had not killed her, but his abandonment, his final, furious act of self-preservation, had delivered her to this slow, cold end. He saw her again in the lightning flash, her eyes not full of terror, but of pity, for him. Her apology echoed in the hollows of his mind, a torturous refrain, I am sorry I loved you. The order from Higgs came down like a guillotine. He was assigned to the deep mine, the most feared and lethal part of the operation, a place from which men seldom returned with their health, if they returned at all. It was a death sentence, slower than the one he had been ordered to carry out, but just as certain. As he was marched away from the quarters, he did not look back. There was nothing left to see. In the cold storage room, Elara drifted. The warmth from the heated stones wrapped in cloth never truly reached her core. The chill of the marsh had settled too deep, becoming a part of her. Mrs. Darrow, defying explicit orders to have a kitchen maid tend to her, came herself. She wiped Elara's brow with a damp cloth, her own tears falling silently onto the rough blanket. She tried to spoon a little warm broth between the girl's blue-tinged lips, but most of it trickled down her chin. The doctor's prediction of a swift end seemed to be holding true. The congestion in her lungs was a rattling, ominous sound with every shallow breath she took. But Elara did not die that day. As the single, high window in the room darkened with the onset of another night, a change came over her. It was not a rallying, not a return to life, but a final, desperate surge of consciousness, a last gathering of the scattered pieces of her spirit before it departed for good. Her eyes fluttered open. They were bright with fever, but their gaze was unervingly clear. They fixed on Mrs. Darrow, who gasped and leaned closer. "Elara, child? Can you hear me?" Elara's lips moved, her voice a dry, papery whisper, almost inaudible. "The bird." Mrs. Darrow leaned closer, her heart breaking. "What, dear? What bird?" "The wooden bird," Elara whispered, each word a monumental effort. "He carved it. In my throat. Hidden." Understanding dawned on Mrs. Darrow's face. She remembered the small, crude carving she had seen once while hastily changing the straw, thinking it a piece of rubbish. She had left it, not knowing its significance. "Get it for me," Elara pleaded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her temple. "Please." Mrs. Darrow, her own hands trembling, hurried from the room. She went directly to the slave quarters, which were now empty save for a few sick and injured. Ignoring the stairs, she went to Elara's old bunk and felt inside the crack in the wood where she had seen it. Her fingers closed around the small, smooth object. She pulled it out. The little wooden bird, dark with the oil of 1,000 touches, felt alive in her hand. When she returned and placed it in Elara's palm, the dying girl's fingers curled around it with a strength that surprised the housekeeper. A semblance of peace, the first in a very long time, smoothed the lines of pain from her face. "He was real," Elara whispered, her eyes closing again, her breath becoming a faint, shallow rasp. "In the shed, he was real." These were her last coherent words. She slipped back into the fevered unconsciousness from which she had briefly emerged, the small wooden bird clutched tightly in her hand like a key to a kingdom she would never enter. She lingered through that night and into the next gray, bitter morning. The rattle in her chest grew louder, more desperate, and then, as the household began its morning chores, it simply stopped. The shallow rise and fall of her chest stilled. The faint, agonized tension left her features. Elara Blackwood, the disgraced daughter, the Ironwood bride, was finally, mercifully, free. Mrs. Darrow, who had kept the vigil, reached out and gently closed the sightless eyes. She carefully pried the wooden bird from the stiffening fingers and tucked it into the folds of her own apron. It was a story that would never be told, a truth that would be buried with this broken girl. She pulled the blanket over Elara's head, marking the end of the tragedy. The circle of vengeance was complete. Sir Alistair had won. He had destroyed them both. But as Mrs. Darrow looked at the small, covered form, she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he had also destroyed the last vestige of his own humanity. The victory was as empty and cold as the room in which his daughter had drawn her last, lonely breath. The end, when it came for Elara, was not a dramatic affair. There was no deathbed reconciliation, no final curse uttered against her tormentors. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible cessation, a final surrender to the cumulative weight of cold, hunger, and a broken heart. Mrs. Darrow, who had kept a silent vigil, simply noted the moment the faint, ragged sound of breathing from the pallet ceased. She reached out with a hand that trembled only slightly and closed the sightless eyes. She then carefully, almost reverently, pried the small wooden bird from Elara's stiffening fingers and tucked it deep into the pocket of her apron. It was a relic, a testament to a truth that would now be buried forever. She pulled the rough blanket over the girl's head, shrouding the gaunt, pale face that had once been the picture of youthful beauty. The story of Elara Blackwood was over. Her body was not given a Christian burial in the churchyard alongside her mother. Sir Alistair would not suffer the scandal of a public interment, nor the whispered questions. Instead, on a morning when the frost was still thick on the ground, two of the most taciturn groundskeepers took a simple, unmarked wooden coffin to a remote corner of the estate, a barren patch of land overlooking the desolate marshes. They buried it quickly, without a prayer, the earth frozen and unforgiving. It was a funeral fit for a nameless pauper, not the heiress of Ironwood. Sir Alistair did not attend. His vengeance was complete, and his interest in its final object had expired. As for Kael, his fate was swallowed by the deep mine. He was sent to the lowest, most airless tunnels, where the rock was unstable and the dust filled a man's lungs with a slow, suffocating death. He worked with a silent, mechanical intensity, a man already dead inside. The memory of Elara's face in the lightning flash, her final, pitying apology, was a brand on his soul. He had been a slave in body, and then, through Sir Alistair's machinations, he had become a slave in spirit. Her death, for which he held himself directly responsible, completed the process. He was a hollow man, a vessel for regret and self-loathing. It was said he never spoke another word. One day, a few months after Elara's death, a minor rockfall occurred in his section. It was not a major catastrophe, but when the dust settled, Kael was gone. His body was never recovered. The earth, it seemed, had taken back one of its own, burying him as anonymously as the master had buried his wife. Sir Alistair Blackwood lived on for another decade, a grim, solitary figure in the gaunt manor. The fortune from the mine continued to grow, but the house itself seemed to sicken and decay around him. The social ostracism that began with his daughter's fall never abated. He was a pariah, a man whose name was synonymous with a dark and unnatural tragedy. He died alone in his library, found by a terrified maid one morning, his face frozen in a rictus that some said was not of peace, but of surprise, as if he had finally beheld the true cost of his victories. With no heir, Ironwood Manor fell into ruin. The mines were sealed, and the valley slowly reclaimed its silence. The local people, those who remembered, spoke of the place in hushed tones. They told of a gray lady who was sometimes seen on the edge of the marshes at twilight, a pale, sorrowful figure in a tattered shift, forever searching for something or someone lost in the bog. They said she was the ghost of the master's daughter, the one who had loved a slave and been destroyed for it. They said her sorrow was so great it kept the very land from healing. But is this truth, or merely a legend born from a grim history? The official records show only that Elara Blackwood, daughter of Sir Alistair, died young of a fever. There is no mention of a slave named Kael, no record of a perverse wedding, no account of a body found frozen in the woods. The tale exists only in the whispers of the countryside, a dark stain on the memory of a place now forgotten by time. Perhaps it is all a fable, a cautionary tale woven from whole cloth. Or perhaps some truths are too terrible to be written down in ink, and can only survive as ghosts, haunting the edges of our understanding, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can fester in the human heart, and the love that can become a curse. The wind still moans through the ruins of Ironwood, and in its sound, one might just hear the echo of a name, Elara? Or is it merely the weather, playing tricks on the mind? The certainty of the story is lost to the marsh mists, leaving only the unsettling ambiguity of a sorrow that refuses to die.